This morning, the Bureau of Reclamation's Colorado River operating data showed Lake Powell near 3,527 feet, with only 24% of live storage capacity left behind Glen Canyon Dam. One signal would be unusual. Several signals together are harder to dismiss. Reclamation reported April inflow into Lake Powell at only 41% of average. Its operating outlook showed Powell could move toward the 3,510-foot range, leaving only a narrow margin above the minimum power pool of 3,490 feet. That is not lake trivia, that is an operating threshold coming into view. But that is not the most dangerous part. The headline is not only that Lake Powell is low, the hidden number is the operating margin left inside Glen Canyon Dam. This is not just a reservoir decline, this is a dam operating margin failure. A few feet on a chart can decide whether water moves through turbines or whether operators are pushed toward lower outlets. So the question is no longer simply how low the lake can fall. It is what happens when that margin reaches the dam, the grid, the hospital, the farm, and the city. Like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching from, because this map is not only showing a lake, it is showing where system risk may appear first. The next clue is not on the surface. It is the release path inside the dam. At the first layer of the dashboard, nothing looks dramatic enough for a siren. A reservoir has an elevation, a monthly study has a table, an agency has a forecast. The Colorado River has always moved through numbers before it moves through headlines. But inside the operating room, those numbers do not sit still. According to the Bureau of Reclamation, Lake Powell ended April near 3,527 feet. That sounds like a very high number until the system around it is placed back into view. Full pool is near 3,700 feet. Minimum power pool is 3,490 feet. The lake was not being measured against a shoreline photograph. It was being measured against the level where Glen Canyon Dam can no longer generate hydropower through its normal power pathway. That is the first warning light. The second warning light is storage. Reclamation reported Lake Powell at about 24% of live storage capacity. In ordinary language, that means the reservoir still contains a huge amount of water. In operational language, it means the cushion that was supposed to absorb dry years, weak runoff, and delivery obligations has already been heavily spent. The third warning light is inflow. Reclamation reported April inflow into Lake Powell at only 41% of average. That number matters because Powell does not refill from intention, it refills from snowpack, melt timing, runoff, and the narrow physics of how water leaves mountains and arrives at the reservoir. A low reservoir can survive if strong inflow is coming behind it. A weak inflow year changes the mood of the room. The fourth warning light is the forecast. The May 2026 operating outlook projected Lake Powell could end the water year near the 3,510-foot range under the most probable scenario. That is not below minimum power pool. It is not the same as dead pool. It is not a collapse, but it is close enough to make the dam, rather than the lake, the center of the story. On their own, these signals could be treated separately. A low storage number could be called drought. A weak inflow number could be called a bad runoff season. A forecast near 3,510 feet could be called a projection that may change. A minimum power pool threshold could be called a technical detail for engineers. Together they describe one larger configuration. A river system is moving toward a narrower operating corridor. The first agency signal comes from Reclamation because Reclamation is not only watching a lake, it is operating a linked system of reservoirs, releases, obligations, and hydropower infrastructure across the Colorado River basin. The public sees Lake Powell as water against sandstone. The operator sees a storage account connected to Lake Mead, connected to downstream deliveries, connected to legal rules, connected to power contracts, connected to turbines, penstocks, outlet works, maintenance schedules, and emergency planning. That is why the first day of this story is not a day at the lake. It is a day in a control room. Imagine the room without drama. Screens, tables, forecasts, hydrology summaries, elevation curves, release schedules, snowpack updates, basin maps, power generation assumptions. No one needs to shout. The system is already speaking in numbers. One screen shows Powell elevation, another shows unregulated inflow, another shows storage in million acre feet, another shows projected releases from Glen Canyon Dam, another shows Lake Mead, another shows drought response operations. Another shows the calendar. Because the Colorado River does not only run through geography, it runs through water years, accounting periods, compact obligations, and operating tiers. At a recent reporting point, the first signal was simple. Lake Powell was low. By the next layer, the second signal was already more serious. The reservoir was not only low, it was low while the incoming water year was weak. By the next layer, the third signal changed the shape of the problem. A weak inflow year was being translated into projected end-of-water year elevations near the zone where the dam has less room to absorb another miss. By the next layer, the fourth signal pulled in electricity. If Powell approaches minimum power pool, Glen Canyon Dam's hydropower function moves from background assumption to operational question, and by the next layer, the fifth signal pulled in downstream water management. Water must still move. Lake Mead still matters. Lower basin users still matter. Grand Canyon flows still matter. But the pathways inside Glen Canyon Dam are not all equal. The map shows a reservoir, but the operations room is watching a machine. That is the abnormal pattern, not just low water. Low water combined with weak inflow. Weak inflow combined with a reduced storage cushion. Reduced storage combined with a forecast near a critical elevation band. A critical elevation band combined with a dam whose normal power pathway depends on the water being high enough. A viewer looking only at a satellite image may see blue water retreating from a pale bathtub ring. That image is powerful, but it can mislead. It makes the crisis look horizontal. Shoreline moves back. Boat ramps extend farther. Marinas shift. Canyons reappear. The operating crisis is vertical. It is measured in feet above a threshold. It is measured in how much room remains between the lake surface and the level where the turbines can no longer do the work they were built to do. It is measured in how much uncertainty the system can still survive. That is why a number like 3,510 feet sounds strange at first. To the public, it can feel abstract. To an operator, it is a location in the dam's operating body. It is a distance from a limit. It is a warning about what choices remain if the next inflow forecast also weakens, if the next winter underperforms, if the next heat season increases demand, if the next set of negotiations does not reduce pressure quickly enough. The day becomes unusual because the river is no longer giving managers the luxury of treating each warning light as separate. In older assumptions, a dry year could be absorbed by storage. A bad runoff season could be softened by earlier wet years. A hot summer could draw from reserves. A legal obligation could be met because the reservoirs had vertical room. The system was designed around buffers. Lake Powell itself was one of the largest buffers on the river, but a buffer can become a countdown when it is not refilled. That is the turn. Storage is supposed to buy time. When storage keeps falling, time becomes the thing being consumed. The Bureau of Reclamation's role in this story matters because the signal is not coming from rumor, speculation, or a dramatic social media clip. It is coming from the operating documents of the agency responsible for managing major federal water projects in the basin. The language is measured, the tables are technical, the warnings are not theatrical. That makes them more important, not less. Official systems rarely panic in public. They move in thresholds, they move in studies, they move in tier determinations, they move in letters, agreements, and release schedules. So when an official operating study begins to show Powell near the 3,510-foot range, the story is not that the agency is predicting catastrophe. The story is that the agency is placing the reservoir inside a narrower set of possible futures, and every future in that narrow band has more consequences than the public can see from the shoreline. A low reservoir pulls in the boat ramp first, then the marina, then the water intake, then the power plant, then the release works, then the river below, then the grid, then the city, then the farm, then the hospital. This is how a physical signal becomes a system signal. The day also becomes abnormal because the Colorado River is not a small local supply. It is a basin-scale system serving cities, farms, tribes, ecosystems, industries, and power customers across the American West. When a lake like Powell loses margin, the effect does not stay in the canyon where the water sits. It moves through agreements and infrastructure. It moves through delivery schedules. It moves through the price and availability of replacement power. It moves through the politics of who cuts first, who saves first, and who waits for the next forecast. But the dashboard does not show all of that in one box. It shows numbers, elevation, storage, inflow, release volume, projected water year end, minimum power pool, Each number is clean. The danger is in the overlap. If Powell were low but inflow were strong, the room would sound different. If inflow were weak but storage were high, the room would sound different. If storage were low but the dam still had a large vertical margin, the room would sound different. If the dam were near a threshold but downstream obligations were light, the room would sound different. The current configuration is harder to dismiss because the warning lights are not isolated, they are synchronized. The reservoir is low enough to matter. The inflow is weak enough to matter. The forecast is low enough to matter. The dam threshold is close enough to matter. The downstream system is dependent enough to matter. That does not mean failure is inevitable. It means margin is becoming the main character, and margin is the part of infrastructure that people usually notice only after it is gone. The public tends to understand disasters as peaks, the highest flood, the strongest wind, the hottest afternoon, the largest fire, the lowest lake, but operators often fear something quieter. They fear repeated load on shrinking margin. They fear systems that still function, but with fewer backups. They fear the day when a normal decision has to be made without the normal cushion behind it. That is the situation Lake Powell is beginning to describe. The lake is not only low, it is low in a system that still has to deliver water, generate or replace power, protect downstream flows, meet legal requirements, and prepare for another season before knowing whether the next one will rescue the last. A reservoir can look calm while it is carrying too many promises. That is the sentence the dashboard is writing. When reclamation issues operating projections, the numbers are not final destiny. Forecasts can change. Snow can surprise. Monsoon patterns can shift. Conservation can reduce pressure. Releases can be adjusted. Emergency actions can buy time. A wet year can widen the margin again. But the point of an operating dashboard is not to wait until certainty arrives. Certainty arrives too late. The job is to identify when the system is losing flexibility. That is what makes the day feel different. The warning is not only about where Powell is now, it is about how many things must go right for the dam to keep its familiar role without being pushed toward a narrower release pathway. The reservoir must receive enough inflow. The operating plan must manage releases carefully. The broader basin must reduce demand or absorb shortages. The power system must prepare for uncertainty. The downstream river must continue receiving flows. Lake Mead must be considered. The legal framework must hold. The physical dam must operate within its safe and known limits. No single item in that list is impossible. The danger is that all of them are being asked to matter at the same time. That is what a system warning looks like before it becomes a crisis. It does not always arrive as smoke, floodwater, or sirens. Sometimes it arrives as a table showing a lake elevation, a storage percentage, an inflow percentage, and a projected range that places a major dam closer to an operating threshold than anyone would want. The day is also strange because the old visual language of drought is no longer enough. Drought used to be shown as cracked soil, empty fields, brown hills, and stranded docks. Those images still matter. But at Glen Canyon Dam, drought has entered a different stage. It has entered the machinery of release. From the mountains, it begins as missing snow or snow that melts into less runoff than expected. From the watershed, it becomes weak inflow. From the reservoir, it becomes falling elevation. From the dam, it becomes reduced head and narrowing operating margin. From the power plant, it becomes uncertainty. From the downstream river, it becomes release risk. From the region, it becomes a planning problem no single city can solve alone. That is the path hidden behind the dashboard. And once the viewer sees that path, Lake Powell stops being only a scenic reservoir in a canyon. It becomes a gauge on a larger machine. This is why the official signal matters. It is not telling the public to panic. It is telling the public where the margin is going. It is also why 3,510 feet matters before the lake ever touches 3,490 feet. Systems do not begin to fail only at the line. They begin to change behavior as they approach the line. Operators plan differently. Agencies negotiate differently. Power managers hedge differently. Water users listen differently. Engineers inspect differently. Politicians speak differently. Farmers calculate differently. Cities prepare differently. The threshold has gravity before it is crossed. That gravity is now visible on the dashboard. The first part of the story showed the official signal. The second part shows the room that receives it. A low lake level is one light, weak inflow is another, low storage is another, forecasted decline is another, minimum power pool is another, river outlet dependence is another. Together, they do not say that Glen Canyon Dam is failing today. They say the system is being pushed toward the part of the dam where the old assumptions become harder to use. The headline number is coming next, but that number is not just a number on the lake. It is the distance between ordinary operations and a very different kind of river management. The headline number is 3,510 feet. At first, it does not sound like a crisis number. It is too large to feel intimate. It does not sound like a flood depth rising against a door. It does not sound like a wind speed that can tear apart a roof. It does not sound like a temperature that enters a bedroom at midnight and refuses to leave. 3,510 feet sounds distant. It sounds like a number for engineers. But that is exactly why it matters. Because at Lake Powell, the headline number is not measuring how deep the water feels to a visitor standing on a shoreline. It is measuring the elevation of the lake surface above sea level. It is measuring where the reservoir stands in relation to the working parts of Glen Canyon Dam. It is measuring the distance between ordinary dam operations and a different, narrower, more uncertain operating world. According to the Bureau of Reclamation's operating data, Glen Canyon Dam's minimum power pool is 3,490 feet. That is the elevation below which the dam can no longer generate hydropower through its normal power plant. So when Powell is discussed near the 3,510-foot range, the important number is not 3,510 by itself. The important number is the space left below it. 3,510 feet is only about 20 feet above minimum power pool. 20 feet can sound generous in ordinary life. It can be taller than a small house. It can be more than the height of a city bus. It can be enough distance to look safe when imagined on a street or against a wall. But inside a river system the size of the Colorado, 20 feet is not a comfort zone. It is a thin operating band. It is a space that can be consumed by a bad forecast, a weak runoff season, a release decision, a dry winter, a hot spring, or a combination of small misses that arrive in the wrong order. The number is not just water elevation. It is a dam operating room running out of vertical room. This is where the story changes shape. A lake can fall by feet and still look enormous. A reservoir can lose storage and still spread across miles of canyon. A person looking at photographs may think the crisis is the distance between old shoreline marks and current water. That visible recession matters, but it is not the whole meaning of the number. The real meaning is vertical. A reservoir is not only a body of water, it is a tool built around elevation. At one elevation, water can enter certain intake structures. At another elevation, pressure changes. At another elevation, release options narrow. At another elevation, hydropower becomes impossible. At another elevation, the river below the dam depends on a different pathway through concrete and steel. That is why 3,510 feet is not just a level. It is a position inside the machine. Lake Powell was built to store water from the upper Colorado River basin and regulate flows through Glen Canyon Dam. When the lake is high, it performs like a massive buffer. It holds wet years for dry years. It supports hydropower generation. It gives operators flexibility in how and when water moves downstream. It helps balance obligations between the upper basin and the lower basin. It gives the system time. But when the lake falls toward 3,510 feet, time becomes thinner. The official threshold below it is clear. Minimum power pool sits at 3,490 feet. The phrase sounds technical, but its meaning is simple. Above that line, Glen Canyon Dam can generate hydropower through the normal turbine pathway. Below that line, that normal power pathway is no longer available. This does not mean the dam collapses. It does not mean the river stops. It does not mean every downstream user immediately loses water. It means the system loses one of its most important operating functions. That function is not only electricity. Hydropower at a major dam is also flexibility. It is the ability to move water through turbines while producing power. It is part of how the river is scheduled, balanced, and managed. When that pathway is threatened, the reservoir is no longer only a water supply concern. It becomes a power system concern, a downstream release concern, and an emergency planning concern. That is why 3,510 feet carries more weight than it appears to carry. It is not the bottom. It is not the line of absolute failure. It is the range where the next 20 feet begin to matter more than the last 100. That is an uncomfortable idea. because humans tend to think in simple proportions. If a reservoir still contains a large amount of water, we want to believe the system still has a large amount of safety. But reservoirs are not shaped like drinking glasses. The relationship between volume, elevation, pressure, and operation is not simple. A lake can still hold a huge amount of water while its surface has fallen into a zone where the dam has fewer choices. The danger is not only how much water exists, the danger is whether the water exists at the right elevation. This is the part that turns an abstract number into a system feeling. Imagine a building with water on the roof feeding several floors below. As long as the tank is high enough, gravity and pressure do work quietly in the background. People open taps, equipment runs. No one thinks about the height of the water, but if the level falls below a key outlet, the building may still contain water somewhere, yet the designed pathway no longer works the same way. Lake Powell is larger, more complex, and far more consequential, but the principle is similar. Water must be in the right place, at the right height, for the system to behave as designed. At 3,510 feet, the visible lake is still there. The canyon is still holding water. Boats can still float in places. The reservoir still contains storage. But the dam is being forced closer to a boundary where the old operating assumptions become less secure. The number is not just lake decline, it is a loss of working height. This is not just a reservoir decline. This is a dam operating margin failure. To understand why that matters, compare three numbers. Full pool at Lake Powell is near 3,700 feet. Minimum power pool is 3,490 feet. A projected level near 3,510 feet sits far below the reservoir's designed high range and only about 20 feet above the power threshold. That places the lake in a strange psychological zone. It is not empty enough for the public to understand as an obvious emergency, but it is low enough for operators to begin seeing a different river. A river with less vertical storage, a river with less room to absorb error, a river in which a number that once looked like a technical threshold starts to become a planning deadline. The season matters too. Lake Powell is connected to snowpack and runoff, not just rainfall that appears directly over the reservoir. Much of the water that matters begins high in the mountains as winter snow, then it melts, enters tributaries, moves into the Colorado River system, and eventually reaches the reservoir. If the snowpack is low, or if warm and dry conditions reduce how much snow becomes streamflow, Powell does not receive the refill the system needs. That is why an inflow number like 41% of average matters next to the lake elevation. A low lake heading into a strong runoff year is one kind of problem. A low lake facing weak inflow is another. The first gives operators a chance to breathe. The second makes every foot more expensive. A reservoir near a key threshold cannot be understood without asking what is coming behind it. If strong water is coming, the margin can widen. If weak water is coming, the margin keeps tightening. That is why the headline number is not static. 3,510 feet is not only a place on a gauge, it is a moving point in a seasonal race. The lake is trying to hold elevation while releases, evaporation, demand, and weak inflow all pull against it. The operating room is not asking only where Powell stands today. It is asking what the reservoir will look like after another month, another runoff forecast, another release schedule, another summer of heat, another negotiation over cuts. A number becomes dangerous when it starts moving toward a threshold faster than the system can rebuild margin. The public often asks whether 3,510 feet is bad. The better question is bad for what? Bad for scenic views is one answer. Bad for marinas is another. Bad for storage is another. Bad for hydropower margin is another. Bad for downstream release flexibility is another. Bad for regional planning is another. At Glen Canyon Dam, the most important answer is operational. 3,510 feet means the reservoir is approaching the band where hydropower uncertainty becomes harder to ignore. It means the dam is still operating, but the distance to a major change in operation has become small enough to shape decisions before the line is crossed. That is how the number appears outside the control room. It appears first as a quiet change in language. Officials speak less about normal operations and more about protecting critical elevations. Forecasts receive more attention. Monthly studies become news. Water managers begin talking about conservation not as a virtue, but as a requirement. Power agencies begin planning for reduced hydropower output. States argue over future rules with less room to delay. Cities watch reservoir levels more closely. Farmers hear that the river system behind their allocations is under stress. Tribal governments, already fighting for recognition and delivery of water rights, face another layer of uncertainty. Environmental managers ask what flow changes could mean for the Grand Canyon. The number moves through the system before it moves through the public imagination. That is why a lake level can be more than a lake level. It becomes a signal that changes behavior. Operators may adjust releases. Agencies may negotiate emergency actions. Hydropower customers may prepare for replacement energy. Water districts may revise assumptions. Journalists may begin using words like threshold, minimum power pool, and outlet works. The vocabulary of the crisis changes because the crisis has moved from scenery into infrastructure, and still, the number must be handled carefully. 3,510 feet does not mean the dam has failed. It does not mean hydropower has already stopped. It does not mean the worst case is guaranteed. Forecasts are not prophecies. They are structured warnings based on assumptions, hydrology, operating rules, and observed conditions. A wet period can change the story. Conservation can change the story. Policy can change the story. Emergency operations can buy time, but none of that erases the meaning of the number. The warning does not need exaggeration. The number itself is enough, because 3,510 feet tells us the system is close enough to the power threshold that every additional foot matters differently. A foot lost near full pool is not the same as a foot lost near minimum power pool. Near full pool, a foot is storage. Near a threshold, a foot is operating margin. That is the shift. The headline number is not only about how low Powell is, it is about where Powell is low. A decline in the upper part of the reservoir may be serious but manageable. A decline near a dam threshold becomes a different kind of event. It changes the conversation from water quantity to water position. It asks not only how much water remains, but whether that water can still pass through the system in the way the system was built to use it. And once that question is asked, Lake Powell stops being a reservoir story alone. It becomes a design story. It becomes a timing story. It becomes a power story. It becomes a release pathway story. It becomes a question about whether 20th century infrastructure still has enough margin under 21st century river stress. That is why 3,510 feet deserves attention before the line at 3,490 feet is crossed. By the time a system reaches the threshold, the most important decisions may already have been made. The cuts may already be debated. The backup plans may already be active. The confidence may already be gone. The threshold is not only a line in the future, it has gravity in the present, and that gravity pulls everything toward the next question. If 3,510 feet is the headline number, what is the hidden number underneath it? Because the visible number tells us where the lake is. The hidden number tells us how much room the system has left to make a mistake. The visible number is the lake elevation. The hidden number is the margin. That difference matters because the public watches Lake Powell from the outside. The official system watches it from the inside. Outside, the lake is a surface. Inside, it is a set of operating possibilities stacked vertically against concrete, steel, law, electricity, and time. The public number says Powell may move toward 3,510 feet. The hidden number asks what that leaves above 3,490 feet. That is about 20 feet. And 20 feet is the number that changes the mood of the entire story. The visible number makes the headline. The hidden number writes the damage. A reservoir can be low for a long time before the public understands what low really means. Shorelines retreat, ramps close, marinas move, old canyon walls return to sunlight. Those images are dramatic, but they can make the problem look like a landscape problem. They can make the viewer think the crisis is about how the lake looks. But the operating room is not asking how the lake looks. It is asking how much room remains before the dam has to behave differently. That is why the hidden number is not measured as a photograph. It is measured as distance to a threshold. It is the vertical space between the current or projected lake surface and the level where Glen Canyon Dam can no longer generate hydropower through its normal power plant. 3,490 feet is the line called minimum power pool. Above it, the turbine pathway remains available. Below it, that pathway is no longer the same option. So if Lake Powell is near 3,510 feet, the public hears a large lake number. Operators hear a margin of roughly 20 feet above a major operational change. 20 feet is not much when the system being protected covers reservoirs, power customers, farms, cities, tribes, ecosystems, and downstream release obligations across the Colorado River Basin. That is the first layer of the hidden number. The second layer is the buffer the system once tried to protect. In drought response planning, officials identified 3,525 feet as a critical target elevation for Lake Powell. That number mattered because it stood 35 feet above minimum power pool. It was not the danger line itself. It was a protection zone above the danger line, a cushion, a warning space, a place where managers could still act before the system reached the hard threshold. That 35-foot buffer was important because emergency planning is not supposed to begin at the edge. It is supposed to begin before the edge. A dam operator does not want to discover the problem at the exact moment the power pathway becomes unavailable. A power marketer does not want replacement electricity decisions to begin after hydropower is already gone. A water manager does not want downstream release questions to begin when the reservoir is already at the line. A city does not want uncertainty to enter the system only after every easy option has been used. The buffer exists because the threshold has gravity before it is crossed. When Powell falls below the old protection target, the system is not necessarily failing, but it is no longer operating with the same cushion. It is closer to a point where every forecast error, every hot month, every weak runoff, and every release decision matters more. That is why 3,510 feet is not just a new level, it is a signal that the old buffer has been eaten down. From 3,525 feet to 3,490 feet, there are 35 feet. That was the protective space. If Powell moves into the 3,510-foot range, roughly 15 of those feet have already been consumed. What remains is not an abstract slice of lake. It is the remaining tolerance of a system under pressure. That is the hidden number, not the elevation alone. The margin left after the buffer is reduced, and margin is where system risk lives. Most people do not notice margin when it is healthy. They notice the water coming out of the tap. They notice the lights turning on. They notice the air conditioner working. They notice fields being irrigated. They notice hospitals operating. They notice cities growing. They notice reservoirs on vacation maps. They do not notice the invisible space that allows all of those things to keep happening, even when one season goes wrong. But when margin shrinks, normal life becomes more dependent on everything going right. A weak winter becomes more important. A dry spring becomes more important. A hot summer becomes more important. An operating rule becomes more important. A maintenance problem becomes more important. A political delay becomes more important. The system may still work, but it works with less forgiveness. That is the danger. Not that every piece fails at once, but that the river system loses the quiet ability to absorb mistakes. A forecast can be wrong by a little. A storm track can miss by a little. Snow can melt too early by a little. Soil can absorb more runoff than expected by a little. Demand can rise by a little. Releases can be required at the wrong time by a little. Each one may look manageable alone, but in a narrow margin, little things stop being little. That is how the hidden number changes risk. It makes time smaller. It makes error larger. It makes ordinary decisions heavier. A lake elevation tells you where the water is. Operating margin tells you how much uncertainty the system can survive. This is not just a reservoir decline. This is a dam operating margin failure. The first people to feel this are not tourists. They are not necessarily the people standing closest to the lake. The first people to feel it are the people whose jobs depend on translating water elevation into action. A dam operator feels it as fewer comfortable release pathways. A hydropower scheduler feels it as reduced confidence in future generation. A water district manager feels it as less certainty in delivery planning. A state negotiator feels it as less room for delay. A tribal water manager feels it as another uncertainty layered onto promises that have already taken too long to fulfill. A farmer feels it later, but eventually, as questions about allocation, pumping cost, crop choice, and planting risk. A hospital or city utility feels it as part of a wider grid and water planning problem. The hidden number moves quietly through these people before the public sees anything dramatic. It enters calendars first, then budgets, then maintenance schedules, then emergency plans, then public language. That is why official documents matter. They do not need emotional language to be alarming. When they begin using thresholds, protection elevations, reduced releases, drought response operations, and minimum power pool, they are showing that the system has left the comfort zone of normal abundance and entered the discipline of margin management. The language becomes technical because the problem has become technical. But technical does not mean small. Technical means the damage is moving through parts most people never see. The hidden number also changes how the reservoir should be imagined. A full reservoir is like a savings account with options. It can support releases, power, drought buffering, and downstream timing. A low reservoir near a threshold is more like a checking account near the minimum balance required to keep essential payments moving. There may still be money in the account, but every withdrawal matters differently. Every delay matters differently. Every surprise matters differently. The Colorado River system is full of promises that assume water can be stored and moved at the right time. Cities assume it. Agriculture assumes it. Hydropower customers assume it. Environmental flow planning assumes it. Interstate agreements assume it. The hidden number asks whether the physical reservoir still has enough room to support those assumptions. That is why 3,510 feet must not be treated like a single scary number floating alone. It only becomes meaningful next to 3,490 feet. It only becomes dangerous when paired with weak inflow. It only becomes a system warning when storage is low, runoff is uncertain, releases still matter, and the dam's normal power pathway depends on elevation. The danger is in the configuration. Low elevation by itself is one signal. Low elevation near a dam threshold is another. Low elevation near a dam threshold during weak inflow is another. Low elevation near a dam threshold in a river system serving tens of millions of people is something larger. That is the abnormal pattern hidden behind the number, and it is why the crisis is not truly at the shoreline. The shoreline is where the public sees the decline. The dam is where the system feels it. Inside Glen Canyon Dam, water elevation is not scenery. It is pressure. It is access. It is head. It is the difference between water moving through turbines and water being routed through lower outlet works if the reservoir falls too far. It is the difference between hydropower as a working asset and hydropower as a missing layer that must be replaced somewhere else. That is where a few feet become consequential. A foot at the top of a reservoir can be lost in a vast surface and barely register in public imagination. A foot near minimum power pool can change the urgency of every meeting about the next operating plan. This is the part of drought that is hard to film. There is no single dramatic frame for a lost margin. No wall of water, no collapsed bridge, no flame front, no siren, just a table, a line, a forecast, and a shrinking distance between where the lake is and where the dam changes function. But system crises often begin that way. They begin when the backup is still present but thinner, when the reserve is still there but smaller, when the threshold is not crossed but close enough to reshape decisions, when the people responsible for keeping the system stable begin to plan around a possibility that once seemed remote. That is the meaning of the hidden number. It is not predicting disaster on a fixed date. It is revealing a loss of room. And loss of room is one of the most dangerous things a large infrastructure system can experience, because it makes the next problem arrive sooner. A hot month arrives sooner. A bad forecast arrives sooner. A legal dispute arrives sooner. A power replacement issue arrives sooner. A downstream release question arrives sooner. A public trust problem arrives sooner. The system still has tools. Conservation can help. Release decisions can help. Wet years can help. Emergency agreements can help. Engineering analysis can help. But all of those tools are stronger when they are used with margin remaining. They are weaker when used at the edge. That is why the hidden number is also a measure of time. How much time before the next runoff season has to rescue the last one? How much time before the next operating plan must assume a narrower future? How much time before power managers must treat Glen Canyon Hydropower not as a stable background asset, but as a variable at risk? How much time before downstream release planning has to face pathways that were not meant to become the normal story? The lake elevation tells you the present. The margin tells you how fast the future is approaching. And if the margin keeps shrinking, the future does not arrive as one sudden dramatic moment. It arrives as a series of adjustments that make the system feel less stable even before the famous line is crossed. That is why this number is hidden in plain sight. Every public chart has it. Every operating study implies it. Every threshold depends on it. But the public conversation often stops at the visible number, because visible numbers are easier to understand. The lake is low, the reservoir is dry, the west is in drought, the climate is changing, the river is overused. All of that may be part of the story, but the operational story is sharper. The operational story is that Glen Canyon Dam is being pulled toward a margin where water, power, and release flexibility begin to separate from the assumptions that held them together. The visible number tells us the lake is falling. The hidden number tells us what the fall is taking away. It is taking away cushion. It is taking away confidence. It is taking away time. And once time becomes the resource being drained, the story has to move deeper than numbers. Because margin does not disappear by magic. It is eaten by a mechanism. It begins in the mountains, moves through the river, gathers inside the reservoir, presses against concrete, and finally reaches the machinery of the dam. To understand why, the story has to move inside the physical system next. The mechanism begins far above the dam. It does not begin at the concrete wall. It does not begin at the turbines. It does not even begin at the shoreline where people can see the bathtub ring around Lake Powell. It begins in the mountain snowpack of the upper Colorado River Basin, where winter storms decide how much water can later become spring runoff. It begins in the cold months, when snow is stored across high elevations like a second reservoir spread over forests, slopes, and ridgelines. It begins before the public ever thinks about summer demand, reservoir levels, or hydropower risk. The name of the mechanism is simple, even if the system is not. Reservoir dam operating constraint under hydrologic drought. That means drought does not only reduce water supply, it pushes a reservoir down into the mechanical limits of the dam built to control it. At first, the problem is hydrologic. There is less water coming in. Then it becomes operational. There is less storage. Then it becomes mechanical. The remaining water sits lower against the dam. Then it becomes social. Power, releases, contracts, farms, cities, and hospitals all begin to feel a loss of margin that started as missing runoff. This is the hidden chain. From snow to soil, from soil to stream, from stream to reservoir, from reservoir to dam, from dam to power, from power to the human systems that assumed the river would keep arriving through the old pathways. The mechanism begins when the watershed fails to deliver enough usable runoff. That failure can happen in several ways. Winter storms may bring less snow than normal. Warm temperatures may cause snow to melt earlier. Dry soils may absorb meltwater before it reaches streams. A hot spring may increase evaporation and plant demand. The snowpack number may look acceptable in one place, but the river may still receive less water than expected because the land itself is thirsty. This is why runoff is not the same as snowfall. A mountain can hold snow in February and still fail the river in June. Snow has to survive long enough to melt at the right time. Meltwater has to move through soil that is not too dry. Streams have to carry it without losing too much to evaporation, seepage, vegetation, and upstream demand. Tributaries have to deliver it into the main river. The river has to deliver it into Lake Powell. Only then does the dam receive the water that matters. By the time the public sees a low reservoir, the mechanism has already moved through an entire landscape. This is the first important point. Lake Powell does not fall only because people use water. It falls because inflow, outflow, storage, evaporation, operating rules, and demand are all interacting. Human use matters. Legal obligations matter. Agricultural demand matters. Municipal demand matters. But the immediate physical mechanism in a dry year is that the reservoir is asked to release and store water while receiving less replacement water from the watershed. A reservoir can survive that for a while. That is what reservoirs are for. They are built to absorb mismatch. Wet years fill them, dry years draw them down. The whole logic of large river infrastructure is that storage can smooth the difference between when water arrives and when people need it. Lake Powell was built as a major storage and regulation point in that logic, but storage is not infinite, and storage becomes less protective when the recovery years are weaker, shorter, or less reliable. That is when a drought stops being only a shortage. It becomes a geometry problem. The surface of Lake Powell does not fall through empty air. It falls along canyon walls and against the body of Glen Canyon Dam. As it falls, the relationship between the lake and the dam changes. The water is still there, but it is lower. The pressure conditions change. The available head for hydropower changes. The distance to key intake elevations shrinks. the normal path that water takes through the power plant becomes more vulnerable to the lake surface dropping too far. Hydropower depends on height. Water behind a dam is not useful for power merely because it exists. It becomes useful because it is elevated. Gravity pulls it downward. That falling water moves through penstocks, spins turbines, and generates electricity. The higher the water surface behind the dam, the more head the system has. The more head, within design limits, the more useful energy can be extracted from the moving water. When Lake Powell falls, Glen Canyon Dam does not simply lose water. It loses working height. That is the mechanical turn. A reservoir decline becomes a power constraint because the dam was designed around water entering specific structures at specific elevations. The turbines cannot use water from anywhere in the reservoir. They use water that can move through the intake and penstock system. If the lake falls too low, the power pathway loses the condition it needs to operate. According to the Bureau of Reclamation, minimum power pool at Glen Canyon Dam is 3,490 feet. Below that level, the dam cannot generate hydropower through its normal power plant. The phrase may sound like a line in an engineering manual, but it is really a boundary between two operating worlds. Above it, water can still move through the power plant. Below it, water has to be managed through different release pathways. That does not mean the dam stops releasing water. It means the release system changes character. The dam still has lower outlet works that can move water downstream. But those pathways are not the same as normal hydropower operation. They do not produce electricity in the same way. They may have different capacity limits, different operational questions, and different concerns under extended use. This is why the real crisis is Glen Canyon Dam, not because the dam is falling apart, not because the public should imagine a sudden collapse, but because drought is pushing the reservoir toward the part of the dam where water can no longer do all the jobs it was doing before. That is a very different kind of danger. It is not cinematic, it is functional. A turbine does not need drama to become unavailable. It only needs the lake to fall below the level required to run it. A power contract does not need a disaster scene to become uncertain. It only needs generation to become less reliable. A downstream release plan does not need the river to vanish. It only needs the release pathway to become more constrained than the system expected. This is how infrastructure risk actually grows. Quietly, by losing options. The mechanism can be followed step by step. First, a weak snowpack or inefficient runoff reduces inflow into Lake Powell. Second, Lake Powell receives less replacement water while releases, evaporation, and system obligations continue. Third, reservoir storage declines and the lake surface drops. Fourth, the falling lake surface reduces the margin above minimum power pool. Fifth, hydropower generation becomes less secure because the dam depends on elevation and head. Sixth, if the lake falls too far, normal power generation stops. Seventh, downstream releases must depend more heavily on outlet works that were not meant to replace the full normal power pathway as the comfortable long-term condition. Eighth, electricity, water planning, ecological flow management, and emergency decision-making all become more complicated. That is the mechanism. It is not one event. It is a sequence, and each step makes the next one harder to reverse. The drought is outside. The constraint is inside the concrete. That sentence is the center of this part of the story. The drought begins across the basin, but the crisis becomes visible inside the dam, because the dam is where water must become function. Water in the mountains is potential. Water in the river is movement. Water in the reservoir is storage. Water through the turbine is power. Water through the outlet works is release without the same power function. At each stage, the water changes meaning. A snowflake in the mountains is future inflow. A stream in spring is delivery to storage. A foot of elevation in Lake Powell is operating margin. A cubic foot of water through a turbine is electricity. A release through lower outlets is downstream flow under different constraints. The same molecule of water can pass through all of these meanings, but the system only works smoothly when each stage has enough margin. When one stage weakens, the next stage receives the stress. That is why drought is not just dry weather. In a modern river system, drought is load transfer. The atmosphere transfers stress to snowpack. Snowpack transfers stress to runoff. Runoff transfers stress to reservoir storage. Storage transfers stress to dam operations. Dam operations transfer stress to electricity, and downstream water management. Electricity and water management transfer stress to cities, farms, hospitals, and households. By the time the stress reaches a person, it no longer looks like snow. It looks like a bill, a restriction, a delayed planting decision, a hotter building, a pumping cost, a backup generator test, a public meeting, a conflict over who must cut and when. But it began as a physical mechanism moving through a river system. This is what makes the Colorado River crisis so difficult to communicate. The public wants a single villain and a single moment. The system offers a chain. It offers many causes layered through time. It offers climate pressure, overallocation, long-term demand, drought, evaporation, policy, infrastructure, and legal delay. All of those can matter. But inside Glen Canyon Dam, the chain becomes narrower. Is the water high enough to run the power pathway? Is there enough margin above minimum power pool? Can releases continue through known, reliable, flexible routes? Can the system buy time before the next dry year arrives? These are operational questions, not slogans. And operational questions are where the drama is hidden. Imagine the dam as a building with several doors at different levels. When the water is high, it can enter the doors designed for normal work. It can move through the power plant. It can produce electricity as it passes. It can be scheduled with a familiar set of assumptions. As the water falls, some of that confidence falls with it. The doors are still there, but the water surface is moving away from the most useful ones. The building may still stand, the river may still flow, the machinery may still be maintained, but the system is closer to relying on lower doors for work they were not meant to make ordinary. That is the image to keep. Not an exploding dam, a shrinking set of doors. The mechanism also explains why one wet month may not solve the whole problem. A strong storm can help. A wet winter can lift the reservoir. Conservation can slow the decline. Emergency releases from upstream reservoirs can protect Powell for a time. These actions matter. They can widen the margin. They can prevent the threshold from being crossed. But if the long-term pattern keeps returning the reservoir to the edge, then each rescue becomes part of a larger question. How often can the system use emergency margin before the emergency becomes the operating model? That is the future echo inside this mechanism. A reservoir system is designed around variability. It expects dry years and wet years. It expects drawdown and refill. It expects managers to use storage as a buffer. But if the dry years draw harder and the wet years do not refill enough, the buffer loses its old shape. The dam still works, but the assumptions around it become less stable. This is how a 20th century structure meets a 21st century river, not all at once, foot by foot, forecast by forecast, operating study by operating study. The science behind this does not require exaggeration. Warmer conditions can increase evaporative demand. Dry soils can reduce runoff efficiency. Lower snowpack or earlier melt can change the timing and amount of water reaching reservoirs. Long-term overuse can keep pressure on storage even when the weather improves. These are not mysterious forces. They are physical and institutional forces arriving at the same reservoir. At Glen Canyon Dam, they meet one another in elevation. That is why elevation matters so much. It is the place where climate, hydrology, law, engineering, and demand become one number on a gauge. The gauge does not explain the entire system, but it reveals where the system is carrying load. A lake at 3,510 feet is not only lower than managers want, it is near enough to the power threshold that the dam's operating identity begins to change. The dam is still a dam. The reservoir is still a reservoir. The river is still moving, but the question is no longer only how much water remains in storage. The question is what the water can still do. Can it generate power? Can it move through the preferred release path? Can it support downstream obligations with room to adapt? Can it help Lake Mead without sacrificing Powell's own critical margin? Can it carry one more dry year? Can it carry one more forecast miss? Can it carry one more delay in demand reduction? The mechanism turns these questions from policy debates into physical constraints. That is the force of the story. People can argue with allocation rules, they can renegotiate guidelines, they can delay cuts, they can challenge numbers, they can hope for snow, they can point to one wet year and say the crisis has passed. But the dam cannot negotiate with elevation. The turbines do not care about political timing. The outlet works do not care about talking points. The river does not care whether a meeting finished. This is not fatalism. It is the discipline of physics. Infrastructure has thresholds. When a system approaches them, every decision made above the threshold matters. The safest place to manage a crisis is not at the line. It is while enough margin remains to act without panic. That is why the mechanism is so important. It converts fear into understanding. It shows that the threat is not a vague image of the West drying out. It is a specific pathway by which missing runoff becomes lower storage. Lower storage becomes reduced operating margin. Reduced operating margin becomes hydropower risk. And hydropower risk becomes pressure on the systems that depend on the dam's normal role. The mechanism begins in the mountains. It moves through snow. It moves through soil. It moves through streams. It gathers in Lake Powell. It presses against Glen Canyon Dam. It reaches the turbines. It approaches the outlet works. And only after all of that does it reach the person who never thought of a reservoir as part of their daily life. That person may not know the elevation. They may not know the phrase minimum power pool. They may not know what a penstock is. They may not know where the release gates sit inside the dam. But they will know if the system loses a layer of stability. They will know through the price of electricity, the planning of water restrictions, the cost of pumping, the uncertainty of farming, the tension in city budgets, the stress inside emergency management, or the quiet recalculation of risk inside a hospital. The mechanism begins above the dam, but it does not end there. It becomes real when it enters a room where someone has to make a decision with less margin than before. The crisis reaches the human body only after it has traveled a long way. It begins as missing water in the mountains. It becomes weak inflow. It becomes falling storage. It becomes a narrower margin above minimum power pool. It becomes an operating question inside Glen Canyon Dam. Then, much later, it enters a room where a person has to keep another system alive. Picture a hospital facilities operator in northern Arizona on a hot afternoon. His job is not to manage the Colorado River. He does not control snowpack. He does not write basin rules. He does not decide Glen Canyon Dam releases. He is not sitting at reclamation. He is walking through a mechanical room with a clipboard, listening to the air handlers, watching the temperature sensors, checking backup power, checking water pressure, and trying to make sure the building keeps doing what a hospital must do. Inside that building, everything depends on continuity. Operating rooms need stable power. Intensive care rooms need cooling. Medication storage needs refrigeration. Sterile equipment needs water. Elevators need electricity. Imaging machines need electricity. Patients on oxygen monitors, pumps, and ventilators need a system that does not hesitate. The body does not experience Colorado River decline as a graph. It experiences it as a room that must stay cool, a machine that must stay powered, a pipe that must keep pressure, and a staff that must keep working when the outside world becomes less reliable. That is the human pathway. Not panic, not instant failure, a chain of dependence. The river crisis enters the hospital through layers that are almost invisible when everything works. Hydropower from a dam is one layer, regional transmission is another, utility planning is another, replacement energy is another, cooling load is another, water pumping is another, emergency backup is another. Each layer can absorb stress for a while, but when one layer loses margin, the next layer must carry more. Glen Canyon Dam is not the only source of electricity in the West. It is not the only thing holding a hospital together. That must be clear. No single dam decides the fate of an entire medical system by itself. But hydropower is valuable because it is flexible, fast, and tied to water releases that the system already uses. When that hydropower becomes less certain, someone has to replace the function. Replacement power may come from other sources. It may cost more. It may require different scheduling. It may carry different risks during high demand. It may add pressure at exactly the time heat is pushing air conditioning loads upward. The hospital operator may never hear the phrase minimum power pool during his shift. But he may hear that electricity costs are rising. He may hear that utilities are watching summer peak demand. He may hear that backup generator testing has to be more frequent. He may hear that a cooling system upgrade cannot be delayed. He may hear that water conservation plans are moving from recommendation to requirement. The crisis reaches him as workload, as cost, as planning, as less room to assume that tomorrow will behave like yesterday. This is how system risk becomes human. A river loses margin, and a person gains tasks. The outside mechanism is hydrologic. The inside consequence is operational. In the hospital, the operator checks the chilled water system because desert heat does not wait for water negotiations. The building absorbs the afternoon sun. The roof warms. The air intake pulls in hotter air. The cooling system runs longer. More electricity is needed to hold the same indoor condition. A patient in a recovery room does not care whether that electricity came from hydropower, gas, solar, storage, market purchases, or emergency generation. The body only receives the outcome. Is the room cool enough? Is the equipment working? Is the water available? Is the staff able to continue? That is why infrastructure risk must be explained through a person. Without a person, the story becomes too abstract. Lake Powell at 3,510 feet. Minimum power pool at 3,490 feet. 20 feet of margin, 24% storage, 41% inflow. These numbers are real, but they remain distant until they pass through a body, a room, a job, a decision. The hospital operator stands at the point where distant water becomes immediate responsibility. He cannot make snow fall. He cannot refill Powell. He cannot raise the reservoir above the turbine threshold. But he has to plan for the world that those numbers create. If hydropower becomes less available, the grid does not simply stop, it adapts. But adaptation has a cost. Utilities must replace energy. Power markets adjust. Transmission schedules change. Other generators may run more. Batteries may be dispatched differently. Demand response may become more important. Customers may see price changes or conservation requests. Critical facilities may be asked to harden their backup systems and reduce avoidable load. For a hospital, these are not abstract market signals. They become budget lines and risk meetings. A chiller replacement that was scheduled for later may become urgent. A generator fuel contract may be reviewed again. A water storage plan may be updated. A heat emergency plan may be rewritten. A maintenance crew may be told that failure is no longer allowed to be routine. The system still works. That is the unsettling part. There is no dramatic collapse in this room. The lights remain on. The hallways remain clean. The monitors continue their rhythm. Nurses move from bed to bed. A family waits near an elevator. A patient sleeps under a thin blanket. The crisis is not obvious, but behind the walls, the building is being asked to carry more uncertainty. That is the form this danger takes. It is not always the event that breaks a person. Sometimes it is the loss of backup before the next event arrives. The same pathway reaches other people in different ways. A farmer downstream may feel the margin through pumping cost, allocation anxiety, or a planting decision. If water deliveries become less certain, the farm is not only choosing crops, it is choosing risk. A crop planted at the wrong time cannot wait for a better forecast. Seeds do not negotiate. Soil moisture does not respond to politics. A narrow reservoir margin becomes a decision about whether to plant, what to plant, how much to plant, and whether the income from that crop can survive another season of uncertainty. A city water manager may feel the margin through conservation messaging and infrastructure timing. A new intake, a treatment plant upgrade, a leak repair program, a drought surcharge, a turf reduction policy, a groundwater backup plan. All of these become more urgent when reservoir storage stops feeling like a cushion. A tribal water manager may feel it through a deeper injustice. Many tribal nations in the basin hold or claim significant water rights, yet some communities still face incomplete infrastructure, delayed settlements, or limited access to the water promised on paper. When the river system loses margin, the gap between legal right and physical delivery can become even more painful. Scarcity does not fall evenly. It often reaches those with less infrastructure first. A household may feel the margin through a bill before it ever feels it through a tap. A worker may feel it through heat. A nurse may feel it through a longer shift. A public works crew may feel it through emergency repairs. An elder in a poorly cooled apartment may feel it as a night that does not let the body recover. The river enters people through the systems around them. That is why the hospital room matters. It compresses the whole chain into one place. Water and power are not separate inside a critical building. Electricity moves air. Electricity moves water. Water cools equipment. Water cleans spaces. Backup power protects life support. Staff depend on roads, fuel, communications, and supply chains. A hospital is not just a building, it is a concentrated demand for reliable systems. When one major regional system loses margin, the hospital does not automatically fail. But it has less room to be surprised. That is the key. Less room to be surprised. A normal summer peak becomes more difficult if energy supplies are tighter. A heat wave becomes more dangerous if cooling demand rises across the region. A water restriction becomes more complicated if medical cleaning, cooling, and sanitation needs are fixed. A power outage becomes more serious if backup systems are used more often. A staffing shortage becomes harder if heat, smoke, high bills, and infrastructure stress affect workers at home before they arrive at the hospital. The event is visible outside. The damage begins inside. Inside the body, heat stress is not political. Dehydration is not theoretical. Sleep loss is not a future model. Medical vulnerability is not a chart. A person with heart disease, kidney disease, respiratory illness, pregnancy, disability, age-related frailty, or limited income may experience infrastructure stress as physical stress long before officials call it a disaster. The body does not ask whether the stress began in snowpack, reservoir storage, or power markets. The body asks whether it can cool, whether it can rest, whether it can access care, whether the system around it still has margin. This is why a low reservoir cannot be separated from public health. The connection is not always direct. It should not be exaggerated. Lake Powell falling near 3,510 feet does not mean a hospital is about to lose power. It does not mean every patient is at immediate risk. It does not mean one dam level explains every problem in the southwest. But it does mean that a major stabilizing asset is under stress. And when stabilizing assets are under stress, vulnerable people are the ones who feel the loss of margin most sharply. They feel it because they have less margin of their own. A wealthy household can buy backup cooling, bottled water, rooftop solar, batteries, insurance, and mobility. A large institution can hire consultants, upgrade equipment, and negotiate contracts. A small clinic, a rural household, a farm worker family, or an elder on a fixed income has fewer options. The same system stress can arrive as inconvenience for one person and danger for another. That is the moral dimension of operating margin. It is not only a technical cushion, it is a social cushion. When the reservoir has margin, the system has more time to protect people. When the reservoir loses margin, the system has to make harder choices faster. Faster choices tend to favor those already closest to power, money, and information, unless policy deliberately does otherwise. The hospital operator knows this in a practical way. He may not speak in those terms, but his work is built around the same principle. Redundancy protects life. Backup systems protect life. Preventive maintenance protects life. Extra capacity protects life. Waiting until the alarm sounds is bad practice. That is what Lake Powell is teaching at basin scale. Do not wait for the alarm line. Minimum power pool is the alarm line. The hidden danger is losing the room above it. In the hospital, the operator finishes a round and checks a panel. The numbers are normal. That is what he wants. Normal numbers mean the system is holding. But he also knows normal can be deceptive if backup is weak. A generator can sit ready until it does not start. A pump can sound fine until a bearing fails. A chiller can meet demand until the hottest day of the year. A water line can hold pressure until the city system loses it. Infrastructure is trusted because it is quiet, but quiet is not the same as safe. The Colorado River has been quiet in the daily lives of many people who depend on it. It has arrived as electricity, water, food, growth, lawns, cooling, jobs, and municipal confidence. It has been built into expectations so deeply that many people do not know which dam, canal, aqueduct, contract, or pumping station stands behind their routine. Now the river is becoming audible again, not as a roar, as a margin, a narrowing margin at a reservoir, a narrowing margin at a dam, a narrowing margin in power planning, a narrowing margin in water management, a narrowing margin in the lives of people who already had little room to absorb another cost. This is not just a reservoir decline, this is a dam operating margin failure. And once that failure begins to move through people, the weak point becomes harder to ignore. It is not the whole river, it is not the whole dam. It is a smaller part of the system, a pathway built into concrete that may be asked to do more if the water falls too far. The next clue is smaller than the lake, smaller than the dam, and more important than most people think. The weak point is not the whole Colorado River. It is not even the whole dam. The weak point is the release pathway left when the power pathway begins to disappear. Inside Glen Canyon Dam, water normally does more than move downstream. When Lake Powell is high enough, water enters the intake structures, moves through penstocks, spins turbines, generates electricity, and then continues into the Colorado River below the dam. In that normal arrangement, one movement serves multiple purposes at once. The river gets a release, the grid gets power, operators work within a familiar range. The system uses gravity as both plumbing and generation. That is the ordinary machine. But when Lake Powell approaches minimum power pool, the ordinary machine begins to lose one of its central functions. The water may still be present, the dam may still stand, the river below may still require releases. But the turbine pathway is no longer guaranteed to remain the usable, power-producing path. That is where the weak point comes into view. The river outlet works. The jet tubes, small words compared with the scale of the canyon, the reservoir, and the river basin. But in a system crisis, the small component is often where the truth becomes visible. A person looking at Glen Canyon Dam from the outside sees a wall of concrete. It is massive. It is imposing. It looks permanent. It looks like the kind of structure that should be able to overpower almost anything. But infrastructure does not fail only when the largest part breaks. It fails when the part needed for the next job is too constrained, too uncertain, too stressed, or too poorly matched to the load being placed on it. The weak point is not the whole system. The weak point is the part that must take over when the preferred pathway loses function. At Glen Canyon Dam, that means the lower release works become much more important if the reservoir falls below the level needed for hydropower generation. The river outlet works can release water downstream. They are real. They are part of the structure. They are not imaginary backups, but they are not the same as the normal turbine pathway, and they were not meant to make the loss of power generation feel harmless. That distinction is crucial. A backup is not the same as full replacement. A spare tire can move a car, but it is not the same as normal tires at highway speed for every trip. An emergency stairwell can move people out of a building, but it is not the same as elevators for daily operation. A generator can keep a hospital alive, but it is not the same as a stable grid forever. A lower outlet can release water, but it is not the same as the full operating identity of a dam that normally releases water while also producing hydropower. The weak point appears when the backup starts being treated less like a backup and more like the path the system may have to depend on. That is why river outlet works and jet tubes matter. They are the smaller body part that reveals the larger illness. The system is not just asking whether water exists in Lake Powell. It is asking whether the remaining water can move through the dam in the way the river system needs it to move. It is asking whether releases can be made with confidence. It is asking whether power generation can continue. It is asking whether downstream flows can be protected while the dam operates inside a narrower range. It is asking whether equipment designed for one role can endure more pressure if the system is pushed into another. This is where engineering becomes suspense. Not because anyone needs to imagine instant catastrophe, because the system begins to depend on fewer good options. When Lake Powell is safely above minimum power pool, releases through the power plant are part of the normal operating world. Water moves through large penstocks into turbines. The falling water generates electricity. Flow can be scheduled within the constraints of law, hydrology, environmental requirements, and power operations. The dam is doing the combined job it was built to do. If Powell falls too low, hydropower generation stops. Then the dam still has to consider downstream releases. But without the same power pathway doing part of the work, water has to move through lower outlets. Those outlets become more central, not because they suddenly changed, but because the reservoir changed around them. That is the first load. The second load is uncertainty. Officials can describe a threshold. Engineers can study outlet capacity. Operators can prepare procedures. But extended use under unusual low reservoir conditions creates questions that normal operation did not have to answer every day. How much flow can move through the outlet works under specific elevations. How the equipment behaves under sustained use. How maintenance schedules adapt. How vibration, erosion, cavitation, sediment, pressure, and wear are managed. How downstream flow requirements are met if the power plant is unavailable. How the system responds if another dry year arrives before the reservoir recovers. The weak point is not necessarily weak because it is broken. It is weak because too many consequences begin to concentrate there. That is the hidden nature of infrastructure risk. A component can be well designed for its intended role and still become a bottleneck when the surrounding system changes. A storm drain may be perfectly normal until rainfall intensity exceeds the design assumption. A transformer may work for decades until heat and demand keep pushing it above comfortable load. A bridge may carry daily traffic until a flood changes the force on its piers. A hospital generator may pass its tests until it has to run longer than planned during a regional emergency. Glen Canyon Dam's lower release pathway belongs to that same logic. The outlet works are not the whole crisis. They are the place where the crisis becomes specific. The phrase river outlet works sounds almost harmless. It sounds like an engineering label, but behind that label is a chain of dependency. If Lake Powell loses the power pathway, those outlet works become a central route for sending water into the Colorado River below the dam. That water matters to Lake Mead. It matters to lower basin states. It matters to cities. It matters to farms. It matters to tribal communities. It matters to Grand Canyon ecosystems. It matters to river recreation. It matters to hydropower customers who may no longer receive power from the same source. It matters to anyone who assumed the dam could keep doing all of its jobs at once. A small pathway becomes a basin-scale question. That is the danger of a weak point. It is never only itself. A storm drain fails, and the road floods. The road floods, and cars stall, and rescue routes slow, and emergency response changes, and the hospital receives the load. The original weak point was a drain. The real consequence was a city losing movement. At Glen Canyon Dam, the weak point is a release pathway. The real consequence is a river system losing flexibility. That does not mean water stops moving. It means the system has less room to choose how water moves, when water moves, what benefits are produced while it moves, and how confidently operators can keep meeting multiple obligations at once. That is the part that makes this more than a drought story. Drought lowers the lake. The low lake changes the dam. The changed dam changes the system, and the system reaches people who may never see the canyon. The jet tubes are especially important because they make the crisis tangible. Without them, the story risks becoming too large to hold. The Colorado River basin is vast. The legal structure is complex. The climate signal is broad. The reservoir is enormous. The dam is iconic. But a jet tube is a part. A release pathway. A place where water must go if another pathway stops serving its normal role. That is something the viewer can understand. Every system has a part like this. The small part everyone trusts because the large system has always worked. The part that is not famous until the famous part cannot carry the load. The part that turns from background into bottleneck. The part that forces officials to speak in careful language. The part that makes engineers ask what happens if temporary use becomes extended use. This is why the weak point must be named. Not to imply that Glen Canyon Dam is collapsing, not to imply that outlet works are useless, not to create panic around a structure that has multiple release features, but to identify the place where shrinking reservoir elevation changes the operating question from how much water is stored to how safely, flexibly, and usefully water can still be released. The weak point is the release path left after the power path disappears. That sentence is the key. As long as the power path remains available, the dam can release water and generate hydropower in the same act. If that path disappears, releases can still occur, but the system loses the power function and depends more heavily on outlet works. That means one lost function forces another part of the system into greater importance. This is how cascading stress begins, not with everything breaking. With one function dropping away and the remaining functions carrying more, the power system must replace energy. Water managers must protect downstream releases. Engineers must watch outlet behavior. Environmental managers must consider flow patterns. States must negotiate under tighter physical limits. Cities must plan with less confidence. Farmers must make decisions under more uncertainty. The public may still see the dam standing calmly in the canyon. But the system behind it is doing more work with fewer pathways. That is the operational meaning of a weak point. A dam is not only concrete, it is a set of choices. When water is high, there are more choices. When water falls, choices disappear in a sequence. At first, the loss may be invisible. A little less head, a little less efficiency, a little more concern in the forecast. Then the loss becomes institutional. More meetings, more contingency plans, more emergency agreements. Then it becomes physical. A threshold approaches. A pathway becomes uncertain. A lower outlet becomes central. Then it becomes human. Someone pays more. Someone receives less certainty. Someone has to plan around risk that did not used to be part of the job. The weak point is the hinge between physical decline and social consequence. That is why Glen Canyon Dam is the real crisis. Lake Powell is the visible storage body. Glen Canyon Dam is the conversion point. It converts elevation into power. It converts storage into releases. It converts a river into a managed system. When the reservoir approaches a level where that conversion changes, the crisis is no longer just that the lake is low. The crisis is that the machine is being pushed toward a different mode. A different mode can be managed, but it is not free. It costs flexibility. It costs confidence. It costs power. It costs planning time. It costs trust. And sometimes, the cost appears before the threshold is crossed. Because everyone who understands the system begins preparing for the possibility. That is the strange pressure of infrastructure thresholds. They act before they arrive. A bridge weight limit changes truck routes before a collapse. A heat warning changes hospital staffing before patients arrive. A flood forecast closes roads before water reaches the asphalt. A reservoir threshold changes negotiations before the lake touches the line. Minimum power pool works the same way. The line at 3,490 feet has gravity. It pulls planning toward itself. It changes how 3,510 feet sounds. It makes 20 feet feel small. It makes the outlet works matter. The lower release pathway is therefore not just an engineering feature. It is the point where the basin asks whether its fallback options are enough. Enough for one emergency, enough for one season, enough for one dry year, enough for repeated low water conditions. Enough to protect downstream flows while the power system absorbs the loss. Enough to maintain confidence while long-term rules are rewritten. The word enough becomes dangerous. Enough is not a single answer. Enough depends on hydrology. Enough depends on releases. Enough depends on maintenance. Enough depends on downstream requirements. Enough depends on whether the next year helps or hurts. Enough depends on how fast demand is reduced. Enough depends on whether emergency actions are used early or late. A weak point is not always a broken part. Sometimes it is a question with too many conditions attached. That is what the jet tubes represent in this story. They are not the villain. They are the evidence that the river system has reached the part of the dam where backup pathways matter more than anyone wants them to. And because they matter more, every other system must listen. Hydropower customers must listen because power through the turbines may decline or stop if the lake falls too far. Downstream water users must listen because releases remain essential. Lake Mead managers must listen because Powell and Mead are linked in the basin's operating logic. Grand Canyon advocates must listen because flows below the dam shape river conditions. Tribal governments must listen because uncertainty in the basin often lands on top of older inequities. Farmers must listen because long-term water planning is tied to whether the reservoir system can still buffer dry years. Cities must listen because growth built around stable assumptions becomes harder to defend when the storage machine loses room. The weak point, therefore, becomes a public issue, even if the public cannot see it from the rim. And that invisibility is dangerous. People are more likely to respond to visible damage: a washed-out bridge, a flooded street, a burned neighborhood, a dark skyline, a dry tap. But the most important moment in this crisis may happen before any of those images appear. It may happen when official planners realize the power pathway can no longer be assumed in the same way, and the outlet works have become central to keeping water moving below the dam. No dramatic picture can fully capture that. A photograph of low Lake Powell shows the symptom. The weak point explains the disease. The disease is not that water disappeared all at once. The disease is that the system's design margin has been narrowed by repeated drought, long-term demand, and a river that can no longer be assumed to refill reservoirs according to the old calendar. This is not just a reservoir decline. This is a dam operating margin failure. And the weak point shows what that failure means in physical terms. It means the system is closer to depending on a lower release pathway after the hydropower pathway loses function. It means operators must think not only about lake elevation, but about how water moves through the dam at low levels. It means the crisis becomes a matter of access, pressure, equipment, capacity, maintenance, and downstream obligation. It means the Colorado River is no longer only being negotiated in conference rooms. It is being negotiated against the geometry of a dam. That is where the story tightens. A law can be rewritten. A shortage plan can be renegotiated. A city can conserve. A farm can change crops. A power agency can buy replacement energy. A reservoir can recover after a wet year. But a dam's outlets sit where they sit. The turbines need the water high enough. The release works have their own limits. The concrete does not move because the basin needs more time. That is why the weak point is so revealing. It strips the story down to physical reality. The system may be politically complex, legally tangled, and emotionally charged. But inside the dam, the question is brutally simple. Where is the water? Which pathway can it enter? How much can move? What function is lost when it moves that way? What happens if that pathway has to carry the story longer than expected? The answer does not have to be catastrophic to be serious. The answer only has to show that a system built around multiple layers of flexibility is losing one of them. That is enough, because once flexibility begins to disappear, the next crisis does not have to be larger to do more damage. It only has to arrive when the margin is smaller. That is the lesson inside the jet tubes. They are not famous, they are not visible to most people. They are not the part of the dam that appears on postcards, but in a low-water future, they may become one of the most important parts of the Colorado River story. And history has already shown what happens when officials begin managing around this margin instead of comfortably above it. This is not speculation. A version of this mechanism has already left evidence behind. It did not arrive as one dramatic break. It arrived as official action. It arrived through drought response plans, emergency releases, reduced dam releases, and carefully written warnings about protecting Lake Powell from falling below critical elevations. It arrived in the language of managers who were trying to keep the system above the line before the line became the crisis. That is what makes the precedent important. History does not prove that the same thing will happen again in the same way. It does not prove that Lake Powell will cross every threshold in the worst sequence. It does not prove that Glen Canyon Dam will lose hydropower on a specific date, but it does prove something narrower and more useful. It proves that the margin has already become important enough to force official intervention. The story can be traced back through the drought response operations of the early 2020s, when reclamation and the basin states began acting not around a distant theoretical risk, but around the operating margin above minimum power pool. The number they were trying to protect was not mysterious. 3,525 feet, that was the target elevation identified in drought response planning for Lake Powell. It mattered because it stood 35 feet above the minimum power pool of 3,490 feet. The target was not the failure line, it was the buffer above the line. It was the place where managers wanted time to move water, time to adjust releases, time to avoid being forced into decisions at the edge. That is the first lesson from the precedent. The system was not waiting for 3,490 feet. It was already reacting at 3,525 feet. According to the Bureau of Reclamation, drought response operations were designed to reduce the risk that Lake Powell would fall below the critical elevation where hydropower generation at Glen Canyon Dam would be threatened. That language matters. It shows that the issue was not only water supply in the ordinary sense, it was infrastructure function. It was the ability of the dam to keep doing the job it was built to do. In 2021, the warning became harder to ignore. Reclamation projections showed a significant chance that Lake Powell could fall below the drought response target elevation within the following year. That did not mean catastrophe had arrived. It meant the forecast had entered the zone where the system could no longer rely on normal operations alone, so managers began moving around the margin. Water was released from upstream reservoirs to support Lake Powell. Releases from Glen Canyon Dam were adjusted. Emergency operations were discussed not as dramatic last resorts for a distant future, but as tools needed to protect the reservoir from approaching critical levels. Then came 2022. That year showed how real the mechanism had become. According to reclamation testimony in 2022, approximately 500,000 acre-feet of water would be released from Flaming Gorge Reservoir, located hundreds of river miles upstream of Lake Powell. At the same time, another 480,000 acre-feet would be left in Lake Powell by reducing Glen Canyon Dam's annual release volume from 7.48 million acre-feet to 7 million acre-feet. Together, those actions were close to 1 million acre-feet of operational protection for Lake Powell. 1 million acre-feet is not a small adjustment. It is not a press release number. It is an admission that the system needed water moved in space and held in place to defend an elevation. This is the kind of precedent that matters because it turns the abstract into the official. The dam did not fail. The river did not stop. The public did not wake up to a single defining disaster image. But the system had to be managed around a shrinking margin. Upstream storage had to be drawn. Downstream releases had to be reduced. The reservoir had to be protected not because someone imagined a dramatic collapse, but because the operating threshold was close enough to require action. That is what a real warning looks like in a managed river system. Not always a siren, sometimes an emergency release, sometimes a reduced annual release, sometimes a target elevation, sometimes a buffer that becomes the center of policy. The same mechanism from the present was visible then. Weak hydrology pressured Lake Powell. Low Powell pressured Glen Canyon Dam. Glen Canyon Dam's power threshold pressured basin operations. Basin operations reached upstream reservoirs. Upstream reservoirs were asked to help defend the margin. The crisis moved through the system before it reached the public as a clear story. This is the historical pattern. A dry basin does not only create a low lake, it forces managers to decide which reservoir absorbs stress, which release is reduced, which future risk is accepted, and how much time can be bought before the next forecast arrives. In 2022, the system bought time, but time bought with emergency operations is still time borrowed from somewhere else. Flaming Gorge is not an infinite reserve sitting outside the basin's problems. It has its own authorized purposes, communities, recreation, ecosystems, hydropower considerations, and storage role. Moving water from Flaming Gorge to Lake Powell can help defend Powell's elevation, but it also shifts the burden upstream. It protects one critical point by drawing from another. That does not make the action wrong. It makes it revealing. A basin-wide system under stress begins to redistribute stress. That is how the mechanism expands. By 2023, the drought response language remained centered on the same target. Reclamation described 3,525 feet as Lake Powell's target elevation under drought response operations, a 35-foot buffer above minimum power pool. Again, the important part is not only the number, it is the logic. The system had formally recognized that managers should not wait until Powell was at minimum power pool before acting. The buffer itself had become a policy object. A foot of elevation had become a form of insurance. That should change how the present is understood. When Lake Powell is discussed near 3,510 feet, the viewer should not hear an isolated number. The viewer should hear a number below the old protection target, a number closer to the power threshold, a number inside the territory where official precedent says action matters. The past does not say the present will unfold exactly the same way, but it says the present is not imaginary. Officials have already acted to defend this margin before. The precedent also shows the difference between a forecast and a threshold. Forecasts move. They can improve or worsen. They depend on inflow, weather, releases, and assumptions. A wet sequence can change them. A policy decision can change them. A conservation effort can change them. But thresholds do not move in the same way. Minimum power pool remains a physical operating line. Target elevation remains a planning reference. The dam's intake geometry does not shift because the forecast is politically inconvenient. That is why official actions in 2021, 2022, and 2023 matter. They show managers treating elevation as a physical constraint, not just a line on a chart. They show that the basin had already entered a world where storage protection required intervention. They show that Lake Powell was no longer simply serving as a passive drought buffer. It was becoming an object of active defense. The phrase active defense is important. For much of the 20th century, the reservoir system was expected to buffer variation. Dry years would draw storage down. Wet years would refill it. Managers could plan around that rhythm. But when reservoirs fall toward critical elevations, management changes from routine balancing to defensive operation. The goal is no longer only to deliver water efficiently. The goal is to keep the system from losing a function. Protect hydropower. Protect release capacity. Protect downstream flow management. Protect compliance. Protect time. This is what happened in the precedent. The system did not wait until all functions were lost. It tried to protect them while they were still present. That is the right lesson, not panic. Prevention. The historical record also shows why the public can miss the warning. Emergency operations often look technical and remote. A person hears that 500,000 acre-feet will be released from Flaming Gorge. and 480,000 acre-feet will be retained in Lake Powell, and the numbers can feel too large to understand. They do not resemble a house flooding or a street burning. They do not produce a single human image. But inside the system, those numbers are human images in advance. They are power bills avoided or delayed. They are release uncertainties postponed. They are water delivery risks managed. They are farm decisions made with slightly more room. They are hospital backup plans facing slightly less pressure. They are negotiations given another season. They are the cost of not waiting until the line is crossed. That is how infrastructure history should be read. Not only by what broke, by what had to be done to prevent something from breaking. The Colorado River system has already shown this pattern. When the margin narrows, managers do not simply watch. They search for water upstream. They reduce releases where possible. They negotiate emergency plans. They invoke drought response agreements. They try to keep Lake Powell above the elevations where Glen Canyon Dam loses options. That is evidence. It is not evidence of inevitable failure. It is evidence of real strain. A system that needs extraordinary action to protect ordinary function is no longer in an ordinary condition. The current moment echoes that precedent because the same critical relationships remain. Lake Powell elevation still matters. Minimum power pool still matters. The target elevation still explains why managers care about the buffer above the threshold. Glen Canyon Dam still depends on water being high enough for hydropower generation. Downstream releases still matter. Lake Mead still matters. The basin still has more claims, uses, and expectations than a stressed river can comfortably satisfy every year. But there are also differences. The present is not a simple replay of 2022. Forecasts are different. Storage conditions are different. Policy debates are more advanced. Post-2026, operating rules are under intense pressure. Conservation measures have changed. Public awareness is higher. Some emergency tools have already been used. Upstream reservoirs have their own limits. The political tolerance for last-minute action may be lower. The physical tolerance of the reservoir may be lower too, depending on the year. That is why precedent should not be used carelessly. History is not a script. It is a warning label. The precedent does not say that Lake Powell will cross minimum power pool tomorrow. It says that when the reservoir approaches critical elevations, the system responds by redistributing stress across the basin. It says that protecting Glen Canyon Dam's operating margin may require action far beyond the dam itself. It says that the real crisis can begin before the public sees a dramatic image, because officials may already be spending emergency options to preserve normal function. That is the evidence history gives us. The mechanism has already happened in partial form. A low Lake Powell has already pulled in Flaming Gorge. A threatened buffer has already changed release volumes. A target elevation has already become the center of official action. A forecast has already forced the system to think about the dam, not just the lake. And each time, the same lesson appears. The margin is not decorative. The margin is the system. When the margin is wide, disagreements can stretch longer. Dry years can be absorbed. Power can be generated. Releases can be adjusted with more confidence. Cities can plan with more time. Farms can make decisions with less fear. Ecological managers can work inside a more stable flow regime. When the margin narrows, everything becomes sharper. A forecast matters more. A meeting matters more. A delay matters more. A dry month matters more. A release decision matters more. A million acre-feet moved or held becomes a form of emergency medicine for a river system. This is why the historical precedent should make the present feel heavier, but not hopeless. The system has tools. It has acted before. Managers know the threshold. Engineers understand the dam better than the public does. Agencies can coordinate. States can negotiate. Conservation can reduce pressure. Wet years can help. The past shows that intervention can buy time. But it also shows the limit of intervention. Emergency operations can move water. They cannot manufacture a new climate. They can defend Powell for a season. They cannot guarantee that the next season will refill what was borrowed. They can protect a threshold. They cannot erase the fact that the basin is operating closer to that threshold than it was built to prefer. That is the unresolved lesson. The precedent proves that the margin can be defended. But it also proves that the system is now negotiating with physics. And once a river system begins negotiating with physics, the story expands beyond one lake, one dam, and one bad year. It becomes a pattern of rules, infrastructure, demand, climate, power, and water, all colliding with less physical space than the old system assumed. That is where the next part begins. This is not only a drought story, it is an infrastructure test, a legal stress test, and a calendar failure. That is the larger pattern Lake Powell is revealing. The lake is not simply low because one bad season arrived. Glen Canyon Dam is not under pressure only because one forecast looks uncomfortable. The Colorado River system is being forced to show what happens when a 20th century storage machine meets a 21st century river with less spare room than the old rules expected. The old system was built around a powerful idea. The river would vary, but the reservoirs would smooth the variation. Wet years would fill storage, dry years would draw it down. Large dams would hold water in reserve, produce hydropower, regulate downstream flows, and give cities, farms, and states time to make decisions. Lake Powell and Lake Mead were not just lakes. They were the two largest stabilizers in the basin. They allowed the Colorado River to be treated less like a variable mountain river and more like a managed supply system. That was the promise. But the promise depends on recovery. Storage can protect a system from a dry year only if storage gets refilled later. A reservoir can act like a battery only if there are periods when the battery recharges. A buffer can absorb shocks only if the shocks do not arrive faster than the buffer can rebuild. The pattern now is not simply that the basin is dry, the pattern is that recovery is becoming less reliable. That is why the calendar matters. The Colorado River is managed through water years, seasonal forecasts, runoff windows, annual operating plans, shortage tiers, release volumes, and long negotiation cycles. The old calendar assumed that winter snowpack, spring runoff, reservoir storage, and summer demand could be arranged into a manageable rhythm. The system could look ahead, estimate supplies, schedule releases, and adjust around a familiar seasonal pattern. But a warmer and more stressed basin makes that rhythm harder to trust. Snow can arrive but melt earlier. Snowpack can look acceptable in winter, but deliver less runoff in spring. Soils can absorb more water before streams receive it. Hotter conditions can increase evaporation and plant demand. Dry years can arrive before the last dry year has been repaired. Wet years can help without fully restoring the lost cushion. This is the calendar failure. The system is still using dates, studies, and operating years. But the river is not always returning margin on schedule. That is the difference between a drought event and a system pattern. A drought event asks how long the dry period will last. A system pattern asks whether the old recovery assumptions still work. At Lake Powell, the answer is becoming uncomfortable. The reservoir can still rise in wet periods. It can still respond to strong runoff. It can still gain storage when the watershed delivers. But the larger question is no longer whether 1 year can help. The question is whether the basin can keep rebuilding enough margin before the next load arrives. The next load may be a dry winter. It may be a hot spring. It may be weak runoff. It may be high summer electricity demand. It may be another negotiation delay. It may be a downstream release obligation. It may be a legal conflict over who must reduce use first. It may be all of these arriving close together. This is how compound risk works, not one giant event. Several normal pressures arriving when the system has less room to absorb them. That is what the Colorado River is beginning to show. Its crisis is not only hydrologic, it is institutional. It is not only about less water falling from the sky or flowing from the mountains. It is also about a set of rules, habits, investments, expectations, and political promises that were built around a river with more dependable margin. The rules allocate water. The reservoir decides whether that water exists in the right place, at the right elevation, at the right time. That sentence is where the legal system meets physics. The Colorado River has been divided, managed, promised, litigated, engineered, and negotiated for more than a century. States have claims. Cities have contracts. Farmers have delivery expectations. Tribal nations have rights, some recognized and some still not fully delivered in practical infrastructure. Hydropower customers depend on generation. Environmental managers depend on flows. Recreation economies depend on reservoir access and river conditions. Urban growth depends on confidence. Each of those systems can write a plan. None of them can vote more water into Lake Powell. That is the collision. Law can decide priority. Infrastructure can move water. Markets can price electricity. Cities can conserve. Farmers can adapt. Agencies can forecast. But the physical system still has to provide enough water at enough elevation for those plans to work. When Powell approaches the 3,510-foot range, the collision becomes easier to see. The lake is still there, the dam is still there, the operating documents still exist, the institutions still meet, but the physical space inside the system has narrowed. Every promise now has to pass through a smaller margin. That does not make the promises meaningless. It makes them harder to keep. The Colorado River system was built for control, but it now faces a form of stress that control alone cannot solve. A dam can store water, but it cannot create snow. A canal can deliver water, but it cannot make the watershed wetter. A hydropower plant can generate electricity, but only if the reservoir sits high enough. A shortage plan can reduce use, but only if the reductions arrive before the physical threshold forces the issue. This is the infrastructure test. Can the built system still perform its old role when the natural system delivers less certainty? Lake Powell is one answer. Glen Canyon Dam is another. The dam was built into a world that expected large reservoirs to create long-term operating stability. The more the lake falls, the more the dam is asked to perform under conditions closer to the edge of its designed comfort zone. Hydropower becomes less secure. Release pathways become more consequential. Downstream planning becomes more sensitive to each monthly study. This is not a claim that the dam was poorly built. It is a recognition that all infrastructure is built around assumptions. Assumptions about water, assumptions about demand, assumptions about variability, assumptions about recovery, assumptions about what counts as an extreme condition. A storm drain built for yesterday's rainfall intensity may still be a good drain, but it can be overwhelmed by a rainfall pattern it was not sized to handle. A power grid built around one set of temperature patterns may still be a strong grid, but heat waves can expose margins that were invisible before. A reservoir system built around one expectation of runoff can still be impressive, but repeated low runoff can push it toward operating thresholds that were once considered remote. The problem is not that old infrastructure instantly becomes useless. The problem is that the load has changed. At Glen Canyon Dam, that changed load appears as elevation pressure. At Lake Powell, it appears as storage pressure. Across the basin, it appears as negotiation pressure. In cities, it appears as conservation pressure. On farms, it appears as planting risk. For tribes, it appears as the cruel timing of scarcity arriving before justice has fully arrived. In the power system, it appears as the need to replace or supplement hydropower that once helped stabilize supply. In the Grand Canyon, it appears as concern over flows, temperatures, sediment, ecosystems, and the river conditions below the dam. The same physical signal moves through many languages. Engineers call it operating margin, hydrologists call it runoff, water managers call it supply, power agencies call it generation risk, farmers call it uncertainty, cities call it planning. Tribal communities may call it another delay in a system that has already asked them to wait too long. The public calls it a low lake, but the system pattern is bigger than any one term. This is not just a low reservoir. It is a stress test of every assumption attached to that reservoir. The most dangerous assumption is that a crisis begins only when a famous threshold is crossed. That is not how large systems usually fail. They change behavior before the line. They spend reserves before the line. They borrow from other parts before the line. They move costs before the line. They make quiet emergency decisions before the line. They begin to ration confidence before the line. Lake Powell does not need to fall below minimum power pool for the system to change. The approach toward that threshold already changes decisions. It changes how agencies model the future. It changes how states negotiate. It changes how power planners think. It changes how water users listen to operating studies. It changes how the public begins to understand the dam. The threshold has gravity before it is crossed. That gravity is the pattern. A new baseline does not mean every future year is dry. It does not mean the river will only move downward. It does not mean wet years disappear. That would be an exaggeration. The Colorado River basin will still have variability. Some years will bring relief. Some seasons will lift reservoirs. Some storms will surprise forecasters. Some policy choices can reduce pressure. But a new baseline can mean something more precise. It can mean that the system no longer gets to assume recovery will arrive fast enough to restore old margins before the next stress. It can mean the old calendar has become too optimistic. It can mean the basin must plan not around average comfort, but around thinner recovery windows. It can mean that wet years are no longer treated as proof the crisis is over, but as opportunities to rebuild margin while there is time. That is the shift the public must understand. A wet year can be real. relief can be real, recovery can be real, and the system can still remain vulnerable if the next dry sequence arrives before the reservoirs regain enough operating room. This is why Lake Powell and Glen Canyon Dam matter beyond the immediate forecast. They reveal the basin's dependence on stored time. Reservoir storage is not only water. It is time converted into elevation. It is the ability to delay hard choices. It is the ability to keep power generation steady. It is the ability to meet obligations while waiting for runoff. It is the ability to protect people from the full force of variability. When storage falls, time falls with it. When elevation falls, options fall with it. When margin falls, trust falls with it. That is the system pattern. The political system often moves slowly because it can. It studies, negotiates, delays, revises, and compromises. Slow movement is not always bad. In a complex basin, careful negotiation matters. Water rights are complicated. Tribal sovereignty matters. Rural economies matter. Urban demand matters. Food production matters. Ecosystems matter. Power matters. No serious solution is simple, but physical thresholds do not slow down to match politics. That is the stress. The river is asking for decisions on a hydrologic schedule. Institutions often answer on a legal schedule. Infrastructure answers on an engineering schedule. Communities answer on a budget schedule. Bodies answer immediately. When those clocks fall out of sync, the system becomes fragile. This is the calendar failure again. A farmer cannot wait until negotiations finish if the planting window has already closed. A hospital cannot wait for a basin agreement if the cooling system must be upgraded before summer. A dam operator cannot wait for political consensus if the reservoir is approaching a critical elevation. A tribal community cannot wait for another generation of promises while scarcity hardens around infrastructure gaps. A city cannot wait for a wet year if demand keeps growing and conservation is postponed. The old system survived by using storage to keep these clocks aligned. The new risk is that storage no longer has enough room to keep absorbing the mismatch. This does not mean collapse is inevitable. It means coordination becomes urgent earlier. It means conservation has to happen before the line. It means operating rules have to be designed for low margin, not only average years. It means infrastructure planning has to include failure modes that once sounded remote. It means power systems must treat hydropower as valuable but vulnerable. It means water systems must stop treating Lake Powell and Lake Mead as infinite shock absorbers. The basin has already started moving in that direction, but the physical system is still pressing. Post-2026 operating rules matter because the old guidelines cannot simply be stretched forever into a different river. The next rules will need to answer harder questions. How should shortage be shared when reservoirs are low? How should Lake Powell and Lake Mead be balanced? How should hydropower risk be handled? How should tribal rights be respected not only legally but practically? How should agriculture and cities both reduce pressure? How should ecosystems below dams be protected? How should the system respond before critical thresholds are reached? These are not background policy questions. They are the system pattern written into law, and the answer will not be judged only by fairness on paper. It will be judged by whether the physical reservoirs have enough margin to make the rules workable. A rule that assumes too much water becomes fiction. A rule that waits too long becomes risk. A rule that ignores infrastructure thresholds becomes dangerous. That is why the Glen Canyon Dam crisis is so central. It forces the basin to confront a hard truth. The Colorado River is not only governed by agreements between people, it is governed by the physical limits of storage, elevation, intake structures, release pathways, evaporation, runoff, and time. People can negotiate shares. They cannot negotiate minimum power pool. People can debate demand. They cannot debate whether turbines need enough head to function. People can promise future conservation. They cannot promise that snow will arrive on schedule. The river system is therefore becoming more honest. Not kinder, not simpler. More honest. It is showing where the old assumptions are too large for the remaining margin. It is showing that demand cannot keep leaning on reservoirs without rebuilding them. It is showing that a low lake becomes a dam problem, and a dam problem becomes a basin problem, and a basin problem becomes a human problem. It is showing that system risk is not one red light. It is many yellow lights that start flashing together. The future will not be decided only by the lowest number Lake Powell reaches. It will be decided by whether the system can rebuild operating margin before the next load arrives. It will be decided by whether conservation is treated as emergency theatre or permanent adaptation. It will be decided by whether rules are written for the river that exists, not only the river the last century expected. It will be decided by whether vulnerable communities receive infrastructure before scarcity becomes the excuse for another delay. It will be decided by whether hydropower loss is planned for before it becomes a shock. That is the larger pattern. Lake Powell is the gauge. Glen Canyon Dam is the conversion point. The Colorado River Basin is the system under test. And the test is not only whether water remains, it is whether the institutions, infrastructure, and communities built around that water can adapt before the margin disappears. But a final step remains, because a serious warning must also draw a line around what the evidence does not say. The next part is where the story has to become careful, because the warning does not need exaggeration. The evidence is already enough. The warning does not need exaggeration. The evidence is already enough. That is where this story has to be careful. A serious system warning can be weakened by overstatement. If every low reservoir becomes a prediction of collapse, people stop listening. If every forecast becomes a prophecy, the public loses the difference between risk and certainty. If every infrastructure problem is described as failure already happening, the real warning gets buried under noise. So the line must be clear. There is no need to claim that Glen Canyon Dam is breaking apart. There is no need to claim that Lake Powell will certainly fall below minimum power pool on a fixed date. There is no need to claim that hydropower generation will stop on a specific day. There is no need to claim that every water conflict, every power cost, every farm decision, and every city budget problem has one cause. That would be false precision, and false precision is dangerous. The evidence says something more specific and more useful. Bureau of Reclamation data and operating studies show Lake Powell near a low storage condition with weak inflow and projected elevations close enough to the minimum power pool of 3,490 feet that Glen Canyon Dam's operating margin becomes the center of the story. The evidence shows that officials have already used drought response operations to protect critical elevations. The evidence shows that minimum power pool is not a symbolic line. It is the level where the normal hydropower pathway no longer works as a power pathway. That is enough. A dam does not have to be collapsing for its operating margin to be in crisis. A reservoir does not have to be empty for its elevation to become dangerous. A power plant does not have to be offline today for its future reliability to reshape decisions now. A river system does not have to fail all at once to reveal that its old assumptions are no longer safe. This is not just a reservoir decline. This is a dam operating margin failure. That sentence holds only if it stays precise. The failure is not the collapse of concrete. The failure is the shrinking of the margin that allowed water, power, releases, and planning to stay connected with confidence. The failure is the loss of room above a critical threshold. The failure is that the system must now pay attention to a boundary that once sat far enough away to feel technical. The visible number is Lake Powell's elevation. The hidden number is the margin above minimum power pool. The weak point is the release pathway that becomes central if the power pathway disappears. The human pathway is the person who feels the loss of margin not as a chart, but as cost, heat, uncertainty, and a harder decision. Those are the evidence lines. What is connected is clear. Long-term drought and weak runoff can reduce reservoir storage. Lower storage can reduce Lake Powell's elevation. Lower elevation can shrink the margin above Glen Canyon Dam's minimum power pool. A shrinking margin can threaten hydropower generation and push more attention toward lower release works. Reduced hydropower can affect power planning. Constrained releases can affect downstream management. All of that can move into cities, farms, tribes, ecosystems, utilities, hospitals, and households. That chain is real, but not everything that happens in the Southwest belongs automatically to that chain. A power bill can rise for many reasons. A city can face water stress for local reasons, as well as basin reasons. A farm can struggle because of markets, labor, fuel, heat, soil, groundwater, policy, and debt. A hospital can face strain from staffing, aging equipment, heat, budgets, insurance, and regional demand. A tribal community can face water injustice because of legal delay, infrastructure gaps, federal failure, and historic dispossession, not only because Lake Powell is low. A serious explanation does not flatten all of that into one cause. It connects what the evidence supports. It refuses what the evidence does not. That is the boundary. The evidence does not say the future is locked. Forecasts can change. A wet winter can lift Powell. Conservation can slow decline. Emergency operations can widen the margin. New operating rules can reduce pressure. Power planners can prepare. Engineers can inspect and adapt. Cities can reduce demand. Farms can change practices. Tribal water settlements and infrastructure can be advanced. The system still has tools, but tools are strongest before the edge. That is the part the evidence will not let us ignore. By the time a threshold is crossed, the safest decisions may already be behind us. The moment to protect a dam operating margin is not the moment when the turbines stop. The moment to protect it is while there is still enough vertical room for planning to matter. That is why 3,510 feet matters. It is not the end, it is the warning band. It tells us that the reservoir can be visibly large and operationally constrained at the same time. It tells us that a few feet near a threshold can carry more consequence than many feet higher in the reservoir. It tells us that water quantity and water position are not the same thing. It tells us that the Colorado River crisis is no longer only a question of how much water remains, but whether that water remains at the right elevation to keep the machine working as designed. The public often waits for a dramatic image, a dry tap, a dark city, a dead reservoir, a closed dam, a disaster scene. But large systems rarely give their most important warning that way. They warn first through margin, they warn through a forecast that becomes uncomfortable, they warn through a target elevation that must be defended, they warn through emergency actions that are described calmly. They warn through technical phrases that sound small until they become the center of the operating room. Minimum power pool, drought response operations, river outlet works, reduced releases, projected end of water year elevation. These are not emotional phrases. That is why they matter. They are the language of a system trying to remain stable while its old cushion is being spent. Return to the opening image. This morning, an official data signal appeared not as a cinematic disaster, but as a number on an operating dashboard. Lake Powell near 3,527 feet. Storage around 24% of live capacity. April inflow at 41% of average. A forecast that can bring the reservoir toward the 3,510-foot range. Minimum power pool below that at 3,490 feet. Nothing in that image screams, but everything in it points. The lake points to the dam. The dam points to the power pathway. The power pathway points to the outlet works. The outlet works point to downstream releases. The releases point to Lake Mead, farms, cities, tribes, ecosystems, and power customers. The system points back to the same question. How much margin is left before normal operation becomes a narrower, more expensive, more uncertain form of management? That is the real crisis. Not one day, not one forecast, not one dramatic failure. A system built around old margins is being tested by a river no longer giving those margins back on schedule. The event will pass through reports. The current forecast will be replaced by the next forecast. The next monthly study will update the tables. Snow will fall again somewhere in the basin. A wet period may lift the reservoir. A dry period may pull it down. Officials will revise operations. States will argue. Cities will conserve. Farmers will calculate. Engineers will inspect. Power planners will hedge. The news cycle will move. But the thing revealed by the warning will remain. The Colorado River system has entered an era where storage can no longer be treated as an endless delay button. Lake Powell can no longer be viewed only as a scenic reservoir with a shrinking shoreline. Glen Canyon Dam can no longer be treated as background infrastructure that simply converts river management into electricity and releases without question. The margin itself has become visible. And once margin becomes visible, the old story changes. The old story said the river was controlled. The new story says control depends on elevation. The old story said reservoirs smooth the hard years. The new story asks whether they can recover before the next hard year arrives. The old story said the dam was a fixed solution. The new story says the dam is a machine with thresholds. The old story said the future would be managed by rules. The new story says rules must fit the water that is physically there. That is not despair. It is a harder kind of realism. Realism means recognizing that the river still has water, but not unlimited forgiveness. Realism means recognizing that infrastructure still works, but not outside its operating limits. Realism means recognizing that conservation is not symbolic when margin is thin. Realism means recognizing that justice matters more, not less, when scarcity grows. Realism means recognizing that a few feet can become the difference between a system with options and a system forced into backup pathways. The future will not be decided only by the lowest number Lake Powell reaches. It will be decided by whether the basin acts while there is still room above the threshold. It will be decided by whether post-2026 rules are written for the river that exists, not the river people wish would return. It will be decided by whether hydropower loss is planned for before it becomes a shock. It will be decided by whether downstream water users reduce pressure before physics makes the decision harsher. It will be decided by whether vulnerable communities receive infrastructure and protection before scarcity becomes another excuse for delay. It will be decided by whether the system can rebuild margin before the next load arrives. That is the final echo. The number on the dashboard is not only telling us where Lake Powell is, it is telling us what kind of future the Colorado River system is entering. A future where warnings may arrive quietly. A future where official tables may matter as much as dramatic footage. A future where the most important failure may be the disappearance of room. A future where the question is not only whether water remains, but whether the systems built around that water still have time to adapt. Lake Powell may rise again. Glen Canyon Dam may keep generating power. Emergency actions may work. A wet year may bring relief. None of that would erase the lesson, because the lesson is not that disaster is guaranteed. The lesson is that the margin has become the story, and once the margin becomes the story, every foot matters differently. The lake is still in the canyon, the dam is still standing, the river is still moving, but the old confidence has been exposed. A system that once seemed protected by scale is now being measured by the narrow space between a reservoir surface and a dam threshold. That space is physical, it is measurable, it is official, and it is shrinking close enough that no serious observer can treat it as background anymore. The warning does not need exaggeration, the evidence is already enough. The future will not be decided by the headline number alone. It will be decided by whether the system still has time to recover before the next load arrives.